Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Slaveryarchive Book Club. Today, we are here to discuss the book, The Women's Fight by Thavolia Glymph from Duke University. And my name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am at Howard University. We have Jessica Johnson from Hopkins University, Vanessa Holden from University of Kentucky, and Alex Hill, who is at Columbia University. We are all the co-hosts of this book club. Then go ahead, Jessica. Thank you so much for being here.
Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be able to host this particular book club. We are here with the amazing Dr. Thavolia Glymph, Professor of History at Duke University, and needs no introduction, but I'm going to offer a introduction as well. I'm going to hold this book like it's my baby. Thavolia Glymph is Professor of History and Law at Duke University. Her work focuses on slavery, emancipation, plantation societies and economies, Reconstruction, and Black political thought in the 19th century US. She is the author of Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation Household, which received the Philip Taft Prize in Labor and Working Class History and was a finalist for the Douglas Prize. She is also the author of the book that we are here to read today, The Women's Fight, The Civil War Battles for Home, Freedom, and Nation, which was published by University of North Carolina Press. It is the recipient of the 2021 Civil War and Reconstruction Book Award, the 2021 Mary Nicholas Prize, and the 2021 Darlene Clark Hine Award, all from the Organization of American Historians. And it is also a finalist for the 2021 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize. Huge deal, huge prizes. Dr. Glymph is also the co-editor of volumes of Freedom, a documentary history of emancipation, which hopefully I can prompt someone to ask about at some point as well, and has many, many other distinguished lecturer and credits to her fantastic name. So we're thrilled to have her with us. This is as much a book club day as a celebration day, given the announcement of the prizes. So thank you so much for being with us here. You can offer comments and questions through this chat if you're on Zoom. You can do it through this hashtag Slaveryarchive hashtag on social media, on Twitter. You can also chat with us in the YouTube chat, which people like to do as well. So please do, if you're in the YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, somebody will be watching and welcoming you and taking your questions and comments there as well. Dr. Glymph will offer a few remarks about her book and about the research and the trajectory of the work. And then we will open it up for questions and comments after that. So I will turn it over to Professor Glymph.
Wow, thank you so much, Anna and Alex and Vanessa and Jessica, for, first of all, for having this book club, and secondly, for allowing me to be a part of it. So, and thank you for the wonderful introduction, Jessica. I wasn't quite sure where to begin, so I'm just going to make a few comments about what I think this book is about, because I'd really like to hear comments and questions from those of you who've gathered today to talk about it. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to try to share my screen. Could one of the hosts allow me to share?
Okay, Thavolia, 1 second that I'm finding you here just to make you the co-host. And okay, let me see, because I cannot make you, okay. There is a way to click on you. Okay, 1 second. Let me see. Where is Thavolia? She's here. Okay. Now you can do it. And I am replacing the spotlight. Here we go.
Thank you. Huh.
Do you see the?
No, I don't see it.
It's at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I just don't see the document I'm looking for.
Okay. Do you have it open, the document?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're like me, there are many documents that are open right now.
Let's see if I can. I'll try this one more time. If not, I'll just give it up so that we don't waste time. Nope. It was my PowerPoint. It's not showing up, so you'll just have to look at me the whole time.
Okay, it's perfect.
Okay, sorry. So the book is about many things, but for me, most fundamentally, it's about home and what home means. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. The first slide that I had was a quote from Toni Morrison, which said that home is like really huge. It's more than just a thing. And I wanted to start there and to talk about what home has meant in the American South and the disruptions of the predominant notions of home in the American South. And also to talk about how I got to this project and where I ended up. First of all, I want to acknowledge the work of so many Civil War scholars and scholars in gender history and women's history who carved out a place for my work and a place for it to land and depart. And so for me, determining what path I would take was a long and difficult path. And when I finally submitted the manuscript, I still wanted more time. I wanted more time to think about what it meant for poor white women to be called enemies of their country, as they were by the governor of North Carolina. I wanted more time to understand what it meant for poor white women to be called gallows birds, that is, people who deserve to be hanged by the Richmond Examiner, or for what it meant in terms of their understanding to be called ungrateful wretches by another white woman, or to be called by a rich Southern white woman, the South's offscouring, which means it's scum and rubbish, taken from the Apostle Paul and the Poet of Lamentations in the Bible. I wanted more time to know what it meant when Mary Livermore, a Northern white woman abolitionist and women's rights advocate, what it meant when she called Black women half imbruted, that is, degraded, reduced to a bestial state. To know more about what it meant for Black women refugees to be at the mercy not only of Confederate soldiers, but also Union soldiers. I wanted to better understand men like General William Harney, the commander of the military district of the West, who assured the white people of Missouri, that the federal government had no intentions to interfere with slavery. This is the same guy, the same officer, the same general, who in 1834 beat an enslaved woman to death in St. Louis. He was tried and acquitted. I wanted to know more, even at the end, about Northern white women, because I'd come to see them so differently. to see the ways in which slavery made it possible for some of them, abolitionist women in particular, to have the time and to have the money to be abolitionist, and how this in turn made it harder for them to support Black women. I wanted to know more about how historians have contributed to erecting and putting on this mask of sweetness that continue to provide historical cover to the inhumanity and brutality, not only of slavery, but emancipation. I wanted to better understand, even at the end, the lure and allure of the plantation heritage business. I wanted to understand why we still call George Washington a gentleman planter, and why the Mount Vernon gardens are still described as pleasing to the eye. To understand why today cotton fields are not only more likely to be in Texas and South Carolina, and to be in China and India, but why still, even today, a perfumed history unstained by slavery remains. Why advertisements today portray cotton as the essence of whiteness and purity. And why we don't think too much today about workers worldwide who turn cotton into expensive sheets. I wanted to know more about why enslaved people who tried so hard to fight for freedom had not been given their due in Civil War history, although that has changed dramatically in the last few years. So centered in the theme of home, my book is a history that tries to expose these things. It is a history of the encounters of women, Black and white, rich and poor, Northern and Southern, and their unprecedented contact with each other across the divides of race, gender, class, and region, as they all wrestled with what it meant to have a home or not. It's about how the war threw into chaos prevailing notions of what the home meant, how it raised to the fore old questions that largely had gone unanswered, how it questioned what had been unquestioned. It's about the turbulence and the dislocations associated with war that forced all Americans to rethink certain kinds of assumptions about the home, to ask really, what is a home? What makes a home? How does the state support certain kinds of homes and support the undoing of other kinds of homes? It seeks to grapple with the role of state-generated and sanctioned policies in making and sustaining the idea of the home as a sanctified place, a sanctified space for some women, and a brutal place, a brutal space for others. The Civil War elucidated women's roles in whether they advanced or protested these kinds of ideas and policies. It forced reckonings with long-standing policies and laws that had worked to prevent the creation of any semblance of home for Black people, and made them easy targets of military fire. Facing their own displacement, the destruction of their own homes, and military fire directed at them, white slaveholding women recognized and winced at the similarities, but nothing that happened to them came anywhere near the subjugation of Black and poor white women. So the book is trying to do this kind of work while recalling the devastating impact of other kinds of wars and other wars in American history, while recalling that the Civil War had enormous consequences, not just for white women, not just for rich women, while recalling that formerly enslaved women worked really hard during the war and after to build free homes, and that white women, North and South, who had built free homes with unfree labor, were forced to build different kinds of free homes. And from the ruins of war, the perfumeries would eventually also be rebuilt. But what was destroyed required a reconstruction of a different kind. The study of women and the home front have long formed an important part of Civil War history. and a robust engagement with questions of race and class and gender has transformed how we understand the war. And what I've tried to do is to add to that discussion, to elaborate on what we know about these inequities, and to provide a different history of women in the war. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. The floor, whoever dares follow that. The floor is open for questions, comments, whoever wants to jump in. Again, the ways that you can offer questions and comments, you can leave a comment in the YouTube chat. You can respond on Twitter using the Slavery Archive hashtag, or you can go down to the little reactions panel at the bottom of your Zoom and just hit the raise hand button, and then I will see you and call on you, and I will keep a queue of those who want to say something. So, okay. And I'll start actually because we have a comment in the chat. Emmanuel, did you want to unmute yourself and say your comment, or do you just want to leave it in the chat and I'll say it?
Sure, I'll say it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And also congrats to you, Dr. Johnson, for your book, which I loved, this and Winstead, which actually starts my comment for Dr. Glymph. I loved and in numerous places cringed in reading the details of your current book. Back in 2011, at the Richmond Asala conference, I remember you silencing the room with the account from Colonel Samuel Naismith about Black people being burned inside their quarters, women murdered, wounded children. And someone asked you, once we sort of recovered somewhat from that, where was this account? And you said in the official records. Do you feel like Civil War era historians are improving their use of the official records to see beyond battlefield movements? Thanks.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for that question. I enjoyed your conversation the other evening at UVA, by the way. So yes, I think historians are doing a better job with using traditional sources like the official records to tell the story of emancipation. Very much so. I mean, not only those records, but other records at the National Archives in particular. You know, I'm thinking of Amy Taylor's book, for example, on the refugees. So yes, I think so.
You have you have an effusive thank you for listening from last week from Emmanuel there. So. Excellent. Other folks?
Well, I've either put everyone to sleep or
you have not put everyone to sleep. But so if others don't have a question, oh, Alex. Alex,
yeah, I know. Is that the book is so wide ranging. Like I just tweeted right now, my last promotional tweet was something that I meant from the bottom of my heart. I just simply had never had experience in one single book, such a wide ranging view of the Civil War. It's just like whatever, it's not only the battlefield. This is obviously not the first book that is outside of the battlefield, but it's just every other book. I never read a book that gave me such a big, even you leave out the West and still this is like huge. So it's the size of it. It's like, and then one of the things that I wanted to ask is about methodology, because you try to get at all the, so each chapter is organized by a different axis, right? Of race and class. And you try to look at all these different women, but even within the chapters, you try to find internal differences amongst, say, white poor women of the South. It's just everywhere. There are internal differences, and you often begin paragraphs by saying, but not all women were like this, and not all women were like that. And I found that to be like a constant trope, and it's just, the result is this comprehension, right? And I just was wondering if that was like by design, is that a feature of like, is that why the chapters ended up being like that, just to be able to grab as much difference as possible? And if you can say a little bit more about your method.
Thank you, Alex. Great question. My ambition, only partially realized, was to think about women broadly. And as you noted, I didn't get to the West. I had initially planned to include the West, but it became too much. And so the West is included in the book that I'm working on now on refugees. But because I wanted to think about women across the divides of race and class, and it seemed to me like so obvious that, okay, that's easy because women lived in spaces and communities and places and houses across these divides, So it seemed quite almost natural that we should be talking about women, Black and white women in contact, rich and poor women in contact. And I didn't at any point really think about focusing on differences. And in fact, until you mentioned it, I didn't even realize it was that like obvious, or it came out that way. I really wanted to focus on what it looked like when they came into contact with each other. And if that led to me discussing differences, that's where it landed. But, in hindsight, there weren't that many similarities or things in common that these women had. So I think that's probably just a function of the history, the actual history of the time. I don't know, does that make sense, Alex?
That makes perfect sense, and especially the fact that that it does feel like these differences you didn't put them there, you just captured them. That's what I said, comprehensive. Yeah. But we're talking about like, well, this is the way things were, or at least the reality, the sense of reality of the book just strikes at you. Like the motivation of these characters of why those encounters didn't go the way one party thought it was going to go, and like there's a lot of deluded people in the characters that come in and out of the book, right? But that history tells us in hindsight that they're self-deluded. But yeah, no, it makes perfect sense that that's just the history, right? The differences were there. It's not that you try to rhetorically add them where they weren't. Yeah.
I mean, and please continue to raise your hand and leave comments. I want to jump in though, because I feel like Emmanuel's question and Alex's question are getting at some of the ways that the history has not been written in the expansive way that you have written it, And so I feel like there's a way that, I just want to like acknowledge the same, maybe not blinders always, but the same ways that people have walked past the sources that you're laying out, the stories that you're telling, the synergies and the differences, the synergies and divergences that you lay out in the story of the Civil War, and the story of slavery and its aftermath. People have not taken those up. I mean, is it too easy to say that it's just like, racism and sexism, that people have not decided to focus on that? Is there something deeper at hand? Because I also see you in focusing on like, it's the women's fight. Like it's a fight that is an encounter across womanhood. And there's something very deliberate there. That was gonna be my first question. There's gonna be something very deliberate there that is a choice, that you are, it's like you're making a claim that that we there are histories that focus on Black women. There are histories that are focused on white women and white womanhood, slaveholding womanhood, white non-slaveholding women. But you, it's like, are making an argument also in just the structure of the story that we still need to bring these together in a particular kind of way. And so I guess that's more of a comment than celebration of the text. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, what does it mean to do this kind of work in the face of a history of the Civil War that literally all around us is invested in monuments and non-monuments and toppling monuments or keeping them up, whatever else it is, and for you to do this kind of history, how did you do it? How yes, speak.
I don't know if I can answer it, Jessica, but I have an abiding interest in what I call seeing people. And it's not just seeing enslaved people, but seeing people in general, and kind of trying to figure out, based on the documents, what if I put these two documents together and read them closely and read them in tandem, what does that look like? And to me, it looked like a women's fight, right? And so the title was deliberately designed to provoke, to be provocative in the sense that, like, what does it mean? Are we talking about a women's fight with just women fighting each other, or women fighting in the war? And for me, the answer was like, it's all of that, right? And I think as you were talking, I was reminded of I had submitted an article for publication, and which ended up being published, but I remember getting a comment from an editor that said, I think this is great, but it will not be liked. And she meant by, or they meant by, Civil War historians. So I think Civil War history is a very interesting space, right? And I'm at the, like, on the corner there of that space. And it's still preeminently a subject matter that deals with traditional warfare, right? Although the number of really terrific books that deal with women in the war has increased greatly over the last decade or so. And lots of great new stuff still coming out. So I think we still have a long way to go. And so what I hope my book does in part is to serve as one of the sort of bases, one of the platforms, right? To say, this is not definitive. This is just like exploring some stuff, right? This is like gesturing towards some stuff that really needs some heavy lifting. And in a book like this, you can't do all the heavy lifting. And so I wanted to gesture towards things that I thought needed heavy lifting. I'd love to see someone, for example, take up the subject of poor white women, which has been sort of done but not done. They're more stereotyped than they are sort of talked about in a serious way. I'd like to see, and I think a lot of this is happening now, a lot of new work that's being done, and dissertations and first books that are about to come out are just coming out. More work on the process of emancipation. We've been talking about the process of emancipation for decades now, but we still know so little about it. So I see the women's fight as just one of those like stepping stones that hopefully we'll see more people take up. there are places in the book when I go back and I tried not to read too closely because I see errors, but when I go back and read, there are places where I think that deserves a book. You know, it's too much for this book. But so this book wasn't designed to be all of that. It was designed to say, look, there's some interesting kinds of questions that we ought to explore here. And here are some of them. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you. We have Dr. Jones.
Superb. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and good afternoon, Dr. Glymph. So I guess I want to push back on something you just said, you know, which is the characterization of your work as, you know, sitting somewhere on the periphery of a field. I'm probably not alone, right, in sort of blanching at that characterization of the work. But let me at least, and maybe others will chime in, but I want to say why I think that your work sits at the center, not at the periphery at all. And it is because, you know, one of the ways I understand this book, or one of the ways in which this book helped my thinking, was in another approach to a question, frankly, that animated the work that I recently did in Vanguard. And that is to understand how it is that sitting in the 21st century, when we look out across the American political landscape, we recognize not only how Black and white women sit materially in very different places, but how they sit politically and culturally in very different places, and oftentimes, evidently, at profound odds with one another here a long time after the Civil War. But I think I took your story, you know, not to be allegory or anything like that, but to be an important, a critical, frankly, maybe, you know, one of the defining scenes for helping us understand how we come to be who we are as a country in 2021. And I don't want to lay that kind of ambition on you if it's not your ambition, but I do want to put it out there that is, I think what makes a book, puts a book at the center, is when it turns out it's a book we need to read now, right, for the now. And this is a book we need now for the now. Yes, we need it to better discern the past and to continue to build the historiography. But I just felt it was a book that had such, for me, explanatory power about the past, but also about the present. And that for me makes it a book of, at the center. And I'm laughing at myself because I don't really have a question. I think I'm supposed to end with like a question mark, and I don't really have one. I just think that's important. That's a perspective I want to put on the table that might not be yours. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, though.
So thank you, Martha. I guess I appreciate that, and I think probably I was trying to say that it, or my work, not that it's alone, but that it's not where the bulk of Civil War work is, right? And so it's here, as opposed to like where that heavy center of Civil War history. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jones. I'm going to pass it to Vanessa now. Dr. Holden has some comments from YouTube.
Yeah, we have some viewers out on YouTube with questions, but we'll start with this one before we move on to any other questions here in the Zoom meeting. Hannah Alms, who introduces themselves as a graduate student at Indiana University, says, Dr. Glymph, you mentioned in the introduction to your book that you did not want to base your analysis on the idea of separate spheres. Is there a different way that you imagine or describe the relationship between public or private, or do you just let the sources lead you to your consideration of public/private?
Well, that's thank you, Hannah, for the question. It's a very big question. And I would just say that in my first book, Out of the House of Bondage, I tried to deal with this question, and the way in which I dealt with it then informs the way in which I handle it in the women's fight. And that was to say that sometimes there's an artificial divide between the private and the public. And when I think about the home in the South during slavery, basically there is no such thing as a private space. A plantation house is not a private space. And so I was not willing to give it that kind of a kind of power that we ascribe to privacy and the home. So I continued in the women's fight to without directly enunciating that or saying so, that continued to inform how I went about the business of writing and thinking about these women.
Thank you. Vanessa, did you have another one from? Yeah, okay. Just checking in. Cool. Excellent.
We follow up on that one.
Yeah.
If we extend that one a little bit, because I mean, one of the things that I wanted a little more of when I was reading it, and that's of course because you set it up. The race question is set up between black and white, but then I'm always constantly thinking of how home pulls at citizenship, and you do mention it, and you do go over like, what does belonging mean? What does citizenship mean? These are questions. But I was kind of wanted a little bit more of that other kind of home, the home where the nation is a nation of home, that where we belong or don't belong. That is also at stake. I mean, I'm not saying it's not there. I'm saying I wanted a little more, and I was wondering if you had thought about extending that a little bit.
I thought about that a lot because, I mean, I think the fundamental sort of to the question and the way in which I pose this notion of home and is that it's in this country and in many other places, the notion of home is directly tied to ideas about citizenship, who can be a citizen, who is not a citizen, right? And I think it's, the home is not just, to go back to the question of this private space, it's a state-sanctioned space. The home has legal power in a sense, through men and increasingly through women too. So it's not this blank canvas where it's just a place where people eat, sleep, but it's a space that's called upon by the state to do certain kinds of work, including to send men to war, right? And so I don't elaborate on that question as much as I might have, or maybe even should have, but I think it's something that should be talked about more, written about more, the sort of the linkages between the home and the state in a way that at least historians don't talk about enough. And even, there's in the work that I'm doing now, I'm dealing, for example, with grief, and it's also state sanctioned, but it's also like imbricated in the home, and so there's a lot there. To your point, it's a very good point. Yeah.
Thanks, Alex. Wonderful.
If I can
You're
hop
rubbing
in,
the book.
I don't see any
Sorry.
other questions, so if I can hop in and
Yeah, please.
comment question, I'll try to end with my voice like this. So even if it's just a comment, it sounds like a question. It's been it's an interesting day to launch into a book like this, because this time period has been at the forefront of my mind this entire past year. We're in a moment of collective grief, and watching folks on the internet and elsewhere move through this moment seems worth marking when talking about a book that covers this particular moment of collective grief, the grief over different things. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, obviously women's labor and labor that is gendered feminine is a huge point of contention, and part of the war happening between women and various communities. But I was wondering if you could talk about the emotional labor that women in the period are expected to perform, because it seems to me that you talk a lot about the kind of the prescribed roles for each group of women. You talk about some of the stereotypes of each group of women, or the deep desire of the dominant culture to have women stand in as symbols for things. But I wonder, what of this fight is over what emotional labor women are and aren't going to do.
Thank you, Dr. for the question. I think that the way you began the question, the comment, really grabbed me, because it's true that this past year has forced us to reckon in a different kind of way with this question of emotional labor. And emotional labor, it's such a big sort of category of feelings, sentiments, and so much. And so I'm going to just try to deal with a part of it that comes most immediately to my mind. It's very difficult for historians, I think, to write about, maybe even think about emotional labor, because the archives don't give us as much direction on this. But I think that's sort of a weak, poor excuse for not doing the work. In the last chapter of the book, and in the book that I'm writing now, I take in this on more directly, because the women that I'm dealing with or studying did a lot of emotional labor, whether it was to, and this may not be the kind you're talking about, but let me just say what I'm thinking, whether it was to comfort each other, and I think I'm really most interested in how women provide this kind of emotional labor that benefits other women. So, for example, in the slides that I didn't get to show you, I would have shown you these cases of women who had abortions, and I talk a little bit about that in the book. And for those women who went to hospitals in 1863, either to get an abortion or because an abortion had gone badly, some of them died in the hospital, but those who didn't die when they went back, they depended on other women to get them to the next step. And I'm thinking of women in the camps who were just there for each other. And so that's the main kind of emotional labor I've been thinking about. I haven't really thought about it so much in other ways that you might be thinking about. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
yeah, I mean, it is, I was thinking about the types of emotional labor enslaved people are refusing to do for enslavers.
yeah, I mean,
some of the things that really made me smile over and over again were all the instances of, self-liberating women or enslaved women saying how much they couldn't wait to smack a white woman across the face, right? Or how much they couldn't wait to force them to do some emotional labor, right? To see the look on their face when they have their own home or they have, they're escaped with their children.
Yeah, there was one example. That was in the first chapter of Anna Oswald, who is a slave-holding woman who has left her home and she's in exile, and she can't move forward unless she has Sarah, right, who's an enslaved woman. And so she's begging Sarah to come be with her. And Sarah's like, no more, like you're on your own. And so you're right, there is a lot of that. And I wasn't thinking of that when you raised the question. So thank you for answering the question for me. Yeah.
Well, answering with my question like this looks like I've inspired, some other questions that popped up in there if you want to bounce over to them, Jessica.
All right, I am. I think it's a clever trick, like this. This question there. We have Jean Gerard who has his hand up. Please join us for this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Thavolia. I have a very general question, but which is directly related with your response to Vanessa. When you were saying in your response that the last step is when women help women. So my question is, when we work on slavery and when we look at the social structure of slavery, one of the main questions we have is where is a link between slaves and as you know, one of the most important questions was about family. Is there family or not family? Yeah, so we are looking for the link, and family was one of them. But other scholars think that another link could be religion. Another link could be during the Haitian Revolution, war, like you in the Civil War. So my question is, in your research, do you look at these women one by one as a portrait and that you collected in a way? Or do you think that there is, I could say in the old Marxist way, a conscience of a group of a social group of women, a difference to be a woman in the plantation or in the home of owner and so on and so on. So how do you, after this book, how do you think this construction of something which is over the individual identity?
Thank you, Jean. So I think what studying the Civil War has done for me is to help me better understand slavery and the links, the social structure of slavery. So the way we do our research, we read all the stuff and we try to make some sense of it. And so doing the research means that you're going to come across portraits of individuals, and also the portraits of communities. And so what really impressed me with the documents, and many of them that I used, is that I was able to see these social structures being unmade and remade, right? Unmade by the war and remade in the war as a result of the war. And again, I go, to the camps where, and this is one of the slides I had too, where I have a lot of these women who are leaving a particular plantation. And one of the things I'm really interested in is what happens when people leave in groups and people leave together. If 20 people leave from a plantation in Washington County, Mississippi, do they stand a better chance of surviving the war than this one woman who leaves by herself? And so I had a NIH grant to explore this question, and I haven't published that material yet, but one of the things that I found was that it made a huge difference. So people who left with their husbands and who left with other people from the plantation, not only from their plantation, but adjoining neighborhood plantations, seemed to have a better chance of survival than people. And so this is not really so odd, because studies of Civil War soldiers have found, for Black soldiers and for white soldiers, find that men who joined regiments who came from the same town or the same community stood a better chance of surviving than men who did. Right? So I'm looking at women one by one, but I'm also thinking about women collectively, women who form these social groups. And one of the sort of, my research is a bit biased, because the women that I can study who form social groups are just one small subset of all the women who ran away. And one of the problems that we still, and I'm trying to figure this out too, we still have no clue, no idea about how many enslaved women ran away, right? And so people are still using this 500,000 number that nobody knows where it came from, right? But anyway, so these women who ran and ended up in camps with other women from their plantation, I can study them better. The records are better for them than for women who ran away by themselves. So women who ran away by themselves, I can follow them through plantation records, federal government plantation records and hospital records and so forth, but harder to follow them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have Laura Wexler is up next. I don't know if you want to come on the video. Ah, yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you. Yeah. Hi. Well, I'm partway through the book, so I have to say I'm in the midst of reading it, but I also have to say that my sense is that I haven't read a book about the war before this. It's almost as if it's not just a history of the Civil War, but it's a rethinking about being a historian of war. What is war? And I see I'm speaking to a panel of quite illustrious historians, so I don't want to overgeneralize, which is I can fall into doing. So I don't want to just say war in general. And yet, to leave women out of the story of war is to actually just not understand what is the reality of war. I mean, I guess there are different kinds of wars and they're fought in different places, but it struck me powerfully that this is, in a sense, the first history of the Civil War. that understands it as war. And I wondered if you had done reading or thinking or, were in intellectual, mental conversation with other writers about warfare, war, as well as this specific war. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that question. In the back, it's such a great question and comment, because always in the back of my mind as I did the research and writing for this book was this idea that this is war. I'm talking about a war. And so what does that mean for women? And certainly, so there's so many books on women in the Civil War. Predominantly, plantation women, but also a lot of books on Northern women. And so I had a sense that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the war got sort of, you couldn't see the war. You could see women knitting and praying and trying to find loved ones, but except when they talked about Sherman coming through, it was hard to see the war. And when you read the archive, the war is just nothing but war. It's nothing but blood and guts and horror. And I didn't want to convey some of that without writing a book that was a war book, so to speak. So war was always there, and it still is there for me, because we're people in the middle of a war, and how can we understand anything? And and going back to Professor Holden's question about emotional labor, understanding that in the context of war makes for a totally new, novel way of dealing with and understanding the whole question of emotional labor, right? So,
thank you.
We have Tamika Nunley up. Professor Nunley has a question. Do you want to come on video or?
I can. I will do it for Thavolia. So I love this book and love your work, and just want to sing your praises, and so excited to have this space to talk about producing history and these ideas that are in this book. And one of the ideas that you proposed, I think in the third chapter, was this idea of the fate of Black women in the Civil War was very much tied to Black women's sexuality. And I was wondering if you could, just say more about sexuality and also the role of sex and in the war, particularly for Black women, but also for poor white women who oftentimes go into sex work during the war, and maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Thank you, Tamika. So I didn't talk a great deal about that. In the back of my mind, and it's like, oh, Crystal's going to do all of that. So I'm waiting for that wonderful book. So there's not much about sex and sexuality in the book. When I sort of, in the places where it did seem to me important to note it or to mark it, I tried to do that, but I didn't mark it as a subject of investigation, right? So when I it just sort of talked about a little bit, again, going back to the abortions. So for me, I've been a scholar of slavery for some decades now, and I have read many sources where slaveholders talked about sort of worrying or suspecting that enslaved women were committing abortion, rather, committing abortion or using abortifacients. But they're, they'd say, well, she looked large, and then all of a sudden there was nothing there. But I had never seen any evidence of abortions until I got to the Civil War. And so it reminded me again of war. How did these women become pregnant? Why did they want to have an abortion? And I knew from other material that I was using that there were a lot of rapes, right? And again, Crystal Fencer is doing this book on that deals with rape in the war. And so, in some instances, even Black soldiers would say to women in the camps, look, if you don't, you're not going to get any rations. And so, there was rape, and I suspect, though I can't yet prove it, that some of these women who had rapes, I know that some of them were kids, they were teenagers. And I suspect they did it because they, like, I'm a teenager, I don't want to have a baby. Or they did it because they looked around them and they saw what happened to women who were pregnant, who often lost their children. Or if you were pregnant and you gave birth to a child, the ration that you got for that child was not enough for that child to survive. So the big question of rape is one, again, I did not deal with at all, really. So we know, because it's war, we know what happens, and the women were raped. I mean, I think, unfortunately for enslaved women, the historiography has paid more attention to rapes where the victims were white women than where the victims were Black women. But of course, it has a lot to do with the view then and for a long time afterwards that Black women simply could not be raped. So yeah, so I can't really answer your question fully.
Thank you. We have Professor Rebecca Scott coming up next.
Thavolia, I've just begun reading the book, and of course I got one finger in the footnotes, in the end notes, while I'm reading from the front, and so of course my question is going to be about method and sources. And you and I have worked together in archives side by side, and I think we've both thought a lot about the different kinds of methods that you use when you're looking to find individuals in the midst of what you know to be events, alongside a somewhat different technique of once you've found an individual in some kind of circumstance, then trying very hard to follow that individual into other circumstances. And as you know, the book I'm working on right now involves a lot of trying to follow Eulalie Oliveau and each of her daughters and each of her grandchildren. And I hadn't expected to be drawn as fully into the war as I am, but then 6 of her children and grandchildren were sold up into Madison Parish, and so suddenly and therefore were not emancipated, even when Eulalie Oliveau won a freedom suit in the name of her whole family. So they've been sold away and no one knew where they were. So my question really has to do with partly what Jessica just mentioned, as the way that things find their way into an archive in wartime, and Jessica was mentioning, or in a moment of emancipation. And so here I'm not really looking for a generalization on your part, but given how extensive your immersion has been into these wartime sources. Are there some particular things that you want to signal or share with other researchers about the kinds of things that wriggle their way into the record that, as people pointed out right at the beginning, sometimes have been overlooked? They're sitting right there in the official records of the rebellion. Are there some examples having to do with the generating of records and then our finding of those records that particularly came to your attention as you were doing this, and then as you're continuing to do the book on refugees, that you just would like to signal in the same way that you were saying at the beginning, there's so many books to be written. We all do this often over coffee or something. Someone will say, oh, I've just discovered there's a record group that's got a sub entry in it that we didn't know about. Are there some things like that that you're eager to share that came from this inquiry?
Oh, there's so many, but I'm just drawing a blank right now, and actually, I'm thinking of the time that you and I journeyed together to the archives at the courthouses in Louisiana.
Went to Point Coupé, that's right.
Yeah,
went to New Roads, Louisiana. Walked past all the Confederate statues to get into the courthouse.
One of the documents that I took from a copy from one of the courthouses that we went to was a document that listed the registration, 1868 voter registration for this parish. What parish was it?
Point Coupé, almost certainly.
Yeah, Point Coupé. And so, and that record of men who put their X down to register to vote in 1868, before the 15th Amendment, there were men listed who were in their 90s, like 4 or 5 men in their 90s. And so I began to, track them backwards, and it was like, it's wonderful what I found as a result of that one document, right? And trying to figure out who these guys are, who they're married to, what happened to their wives during the war. Some of the guys, some of the men were in their 30s, and they had made the journey from North Carolina or Virginia, the domestic slave trade. And so, it's that kind of, when I copied the record, I just thought it was fascinating, but I didn't know at the time where it might lead me. But I think, so I think the lesson there is that we can't always know where our sources will lead us, but it's really important that we follow, that we keep digging in, right? That one little, and you do this, of course, very well. One document can lead you and have led you to like take a trip to Cuba to find one piece of one document, right? So we're so lucky to be able to do this kind of work that hopefully will have, some impact on our world today, and how that works out. I haven't quite figured out yet, but for historians to have this, like all of these resources where we can just sit down and read and track a document and follow a source, it's just the most amazing and wonderful thing. And so I'm sort of rambling in answer to your question because it's such a fascinating question. It's one that a question that gets to the sort of heart of what I feel I am as a scholar, that trying to make sense of a source and trying to decide how that is the method, how I will figure out what that source means, and where it can possibly take me.
And if I can just do one quick follow-up, it's so interesting because it's also illuminating of the illogic of where documents will turn up. So I agree with you that those registration lists from the period of the military Reconstruction Acts before the amendment are absolutely valuable, but there's no uniform logic as to where they're going to be. So that one was in the Point Coupé parish courthouse, but the one for Lafourche Parish is sitting in a cardboard box in Baton Rouge in the state archives, uncatalogued. The only way you can find it is just by taking every piece of paper out of a cardboard box that's just sitting there. And so there's a kind of it's not just serendipity, it's a sort of thinking, and Martha Jones has written about this with trying to find the record of someone's registration to vote. Those things can be in the most idiosyncratic places. They can be in municipal or state, or they can be in private hands. There's no necessary uniformity to the archiving. So as you say, it makes the chase involve a kind of detective work that's different from the kind we teach in methods courses, because it requires a somewhat obsessive, imaginative exercise of where in God's earth the next piece of evidence could possibly be.
But that's one of the problems with trying to write the history of enslaved people and Black people, right? During the war, it took me 2 years to find records that I knew were at the National Archives, but they are not indexed. And I knew they were there, but it took me 2 years to find them. And when I did find them, my God, it was a revelation. And the records, I write about it a little bit in this book and more in the next book, it had to do with the Freedmen's Fund, right? So the only women in the United States who were taxed during the war were Black women, right? Their labor was taxed. They paid a tax, and the money was collected by the federal government. And when the war was over, there was enough money in that fund to give to Fisk and Howard and 6 or 7 other universities to help them get established. And so no one talked about it, right? So that seemed to me like crazy, that these women were taxed and that they helped to fund HBCUs, and no HBCU recognizes them. So, because I knew those records were federal government records, I knew they were someplace, so I did the chase. And it was totally worth the chase to put them, Professor Jones, I like the way that she frames the women of the vanguard, to put these women in our history for not just because they were enslaved, not just because they were exploited by the federal government, but also because the HBCUs owe them a debt of gratitude.
Thank you so much for that. So much there. We have Alicia Araujo up next. And I don't know what you're going to ask, but a lot of this sounds like reparations. So it's nice that you're following up on this, you being, Alicia, one of the experts on thinking about reparations, slavery and reparations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will follow up this is not, I had a question that was more related to what Tamika already asked, then I will come back to that as well. But regarding the HBCUs, is important what you are bringing, because I remember when I was doing the book on reparations, then I was focusing on financial reparations and material reparations. And when I was discussing the one chapter, indeed, in a seminar at Howard, I remember a colleague who suggested me that the creation of HBCUs itself, the creation of these institutions was reparations for former enslaved people. And of course, to me, that would be more a kind of symbolic reparation. But what we are bringing here is indeed the opposite. You are saying that Black women themselves, they are those who funded these institutions. Then again, they are paying for a second time to create these institutions that for some people are perceived as a sort of gift that was given to freed people after the end of slavery. But then I will come back quickly to the question that Tamika brought, more in the sense of combining with what Rebecca raised in terms of the sources, because we had here several books. We have been discussing this issue several times. When we discussed Jessica's book, also an edited book by Tatiana Seijas, Terry Snyder, and Erica Ball, this insistence and the return of the issue of the silence of the archives, of the records not being there. And when you were talking about enslaved people and Black women in particular, enslaved women. One of the gaps would be the issue of sexual violence. Then Tamika asked about sexuality, and you brought this through you raised the issue of rape. And in the book, of course, you don't bring much about the question of rape, but here we have two dimensions that I think that are important. On the one hand, that enslaved women, they were raped before the war, than when it was not wartime. On the other hand, in a context of warfare, rape is always something that is present, and it was present in Africa when then people were being captured to be sold into slavery. Then I just bring that again in terms of thinking if these records that you look at, because the amount of archives that you consulted to write this book is huge. I ask that it's not in the book, and I understand that this is not the focus of the book, but I ask myself whether or not the records that you consulted, or that could be consulted regarding the Civil War, if they could provide elements regarding this dimension of sexual violence against Black women and enslaved women. And this also then connects with a second part of the question. Then of the Civil War has been then the sort of marks the sort of exceptional element of the end of slavery and slavery in the United States. Of course, for those of us working in other geographical areas, this is something that sometimes it can be annoying. But for us who are working in other geographical areas, it seems to be amazing the number, the volume of sources that sources in terms of the written record that was left and that is available for historians working on this. Now with COVID, what you are seeing is that many of these records, perhaps they are unavailable for us. If they are in archives that are not digitized, but it's still, you as historians, they have access to many of these archives that are now digitized because, of course, there are financial means. Then I ask myself whether what we find about enslaved women, in particular, in the period and in the sources that you examine, how much do they tell us about what was before? Because this is an exceptional moment. People are moving to one place to another. They are running away. It's a period of more or less chaos. And some of these women, of course, they are experiencing to some extent a certain level of freedom, but I ask to which extent this experience there during those years of the Civil War, they can be compared to the period before, or if this is pure exceptional, then if it's so exceptional that this cannot be done. finally, a question that I always ask as well, regarding the sources, then you are looking at people, these women, they have names, and the period that you are looking at, of course, photography was already there. We have a number of works now that are dealing with photography, photographs that use photographs of enslaved people and freed people. And I ask, to which extent did you see these kind of sources could be useful or not in the work that you do, how much they could add, or if they would not add much in terms of knowing more about these women?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I'll start with the last one, photographs. There are not, there's not an abundance of photographs, and most of the photographs that we have of the war are of Black soldiers and sometimes soldiers' wives. In the pension records, there are photographs, especially of Black men. I didn't use many of those photographs. I don't, I think photographs and images always help to make a book, that much more livelier. So I, certainly could have used more, but I didn't. In terms of sexual violence, to go back to that question, the records, the sources that I consulted, there is, one could easily write a book about sexual violence using those sources. And I held back again because I knew other people were working on this and would, because that was the main thing they were working on, would do like a really much better job than I would do trying to say a couple of words about it. But because these are federal records, mainly that I'm dealing with, federal records and the records of slaveholders, and soldiers talk about sexual violence all the time, right? Whether it's a soldier writing to his wife saying, I'm not doing it, but Joe, you remember Joe from, Mary's husband? Like Joe is like sleeping with this woman or that woman or a Black woman. Men who were working on the telegraph system, who were responsible for sending the telegrams from one commander to another commander. They always talked about what they heard about who was sleeping with whom and who was getting raped or who was raping whom. So the records are full of documents about sexual violence. It just wasn't, a question that I was dealing with. So, I mean, and you're right about the US Civil War being a war in which historians are just awash in documents. And again, because the federal government and the Confederate government, and I'm using more records from the federal government than the Confederate, kept such voluminous records, and which has something to do with the silence of the archives, right? So for me, as a Civil War historian trying to do this kind of work, my archives are like bursting. They are full of voices. Now, so someone, said, well, they're not the voices of African Americans. Well, that's not true. There are the voices too of African American women who are writing to a commander, writing to Lincoln, or writing to their husbands, and saying this, that, or the other, complaining or asking. One of the letters I had to show today was from a Black soldier. And what I love about the letter is that he asked his wife, he said, we've had a child since I've been gone. So would you please send me a lock of this child's hair? And so for Civil War historians, the archive is just like talking. It's just like full of records. It doesn't mean that Civil War historians have done a good job of listening, right, to those records. And so one of the things I hope that my work does do is to listen.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a comments question from Sophia Polisar. Do you want to come on video, Sophia? Are you here?
Yeah, I probably shouldn't come on video because I just took an exam, so it's not looking too good. But yeah, so let me just pull up my question. So I know it's a little different than what we've been talking about tonight and what you guys have been talking about, but I guess I wanted to know your opinion on what would you say about kind of the exclusionary aspects of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, and even in a way Civil War, it can extend to that as well. I mean, I think we see in like history textbooks and K through 12 traditional education that we learn about women very selectively, and if we do, it's not intersectional. So, you know, we learn about Abigail Adams and her commitment to this said Republican motherhood and her husband's political career, and some like have categorized her as the first feminist because of her whole Remember the Ladies letter to her husband. And when in reality, I think, you know, historians have kind of interpreted it as that was more for protection under marriage laws rather than for suffrage and for women equality. So I think when we learn about women's right to vote, when we learn about the suffrage movement, when we learn about women's participation in wartime efforts and in political careers and spheres, we learn about a very limited and a very selected group of women. You know, Elizabeth Stanton, we learn about Abigail Adams, we learn about Susan B. Anthony, but we don't discuss like the racism or the judgment, the prejudices that they held. We hear little selective accounts from them in standard education. We learn about more privileged historical figures. So I guess I'm asking, what would you say about that exclusionary aspect of it? I mean, it's a little different than what we've been talking about tonight, and I may have worded it poorly, but yeah, that was kind of my question.
So it's a question, thank you for the question. Is it, are you asking why?
I guess I would say
like why we've been so negligent in including a wider variety of voices, or yeah, go ahead, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I guess I would say, you know, there's reasons that I think we all kind of know. You know, there was less literacy for women during the time, there was less education for women, there were less opportunities, and there still are limited opportunities in modern times. But I guess I'd say, why do you think we continue to learn about the accounts of these women and their efforts and their participation in such a limited scope, in such an anti-intersectional scope, when we are like known as a country that's like progress, you know, change, democracy and liberty, and, you know, this rhetoric that's like mostly just rhetoric. It doesn't like have true meaning. It's not really applied. I mean, this is kind of my interpretation, but yeah, I guess, does that make more sense?
Yes, thank you for that. So, I mean, I think we all recognize, as you just noted, that there's a great deal of hypocrisy, right, in our nation's history and present. There's a huge disconnect between what the founding documents proclaimed and the reality at that time and still today, as we're witnessing daily in this country now. So it shouldn't surprise us that it's still not the case that women have, or the history of women has gotten its due, and especially the history of women who have been historically marginalized, like African-American women, and I should point out, even women who were married to powerful men and who were claimed elite status in their own right, were not seen by historians as having a political voice worthy of being noted or heard. So that, of course, is where we are and where we've been. And I don't know how long it will take us to get to a different place where we can say, or we wouldn't be surprised, rather, to read a book about women whose voices we have not heard before. We would just think, oh, okay, we're just doing better and better. But even with all of the great work that's being done now by historians, we still have a long way to go. In terms of not just putting women in the books, but recognizing and marking that women have had something to say that's important to hear. That is what makes the difference, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. We have Professor Nunley.
So this is going along your last point about how there's so much we don't know, and there's so much work that still needs to be done. And I'm wondering, what are some of your hopes for some historiographical questions and new directions that you like to see emerge in newer scholarship?
Well, I would point to Dr. Holden's forthcoming book. I would point to your new just published book. I would point to Professor Johnson's award-winning book. I would point to Anna's award. Wonderful. Anna's so prolific. I just want to be her when I grow up. Her wonderful work. So I don't have a specific. So I think if I thought about it, I'm hopeful that what I see emerging in the historic is a body of work that collectively says to the profession, there are some really important new ways to think about questions that we've had before us in the past. There's some new ways not only to think, but you're right, new methodologies that we ought to consider. And I don't have like a list of in my head of what ought to come next, but I'm inspired by what has come and what's coming. I think more, if I could say, to go back to the point about sexuality, I think definitely we need more work on sexuality. I think we need more work still that questions who we are, like as scholars, what we are doing to the archive. So it's not just a question of whether the archive is silent or not silent, but it's also a question of what we do to it that I think makes a difference, what we bring to it and how we can enter into it and move it around, how our language can move things, can say to someone who put this document in this archive in 1910, hey, look, you put it here to do a certain kind of work, but as a historian, I can move it around. I can, without changing anything that you have said, I can put it in a context. So for me, I don't have to say elite white Southern women were evil. They say it themselves. And so I just put it out there. I just move their document to where it's prominent, right? I don't let the prominence be the document that says, oh, we're so sweet. And, we're just pretty, floating around, butterflies, gentle as whatever. No, I take a document that you also put there that says that I beat the crap out of this woman, right? And so it's, we call it methodology, but it's something really simple that we can teach our students. That what is it that we mean by methodology? What is it that we want them to do? And I think I want my students to go into the archive and move stuff around, and to use their language to move things around. Words matter. And if we are comfortable just repeating almost verbatim what somebody said, that's fine, but it has to be, scholars of slavery can't be the only people who don't understand this, right? I mean, historians, U.B. Phillips and all those guys, they were doing this all the while. They were taking documents that they wanted to put in the forefront and putting them in the forefront. And the rest of the stuff that they didn't want in the forefront, they left behind. So we come along and we say, and there were others who came along, W.B. Du Bois, who came along before and said, I know that, I'm going to change this up a little bit. And so that's still our obligation as scholars, period, in my view.
So, yes, just yes, we're in the chat, just like, just exclaiming, and you have taken us to church. That was absolutely a word and a inspiration and a call to action as we try and do this work and move it forward. So thank you for that, and thank you for the inspiration and the groundwork and the ground making that your book and your books and all of your work does. It really truly has laid the foundation for those of us who are trying to do the work now. It is charting new paths for those who are trying to, enter into this work. It is doing and giving so much, and it continues to. So, so thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Oh,
thank you all for coming. Thank you for engaging the book. You conveners of this club, you're doing God's work, whether you believe in God or not. This is like wonderful, amazing space to which we are grateful to you for providing. So.
Thank you. I'm passing it on to Anna to close us out with some updates.
Thank you so much, Thavolia. Thank you so much, Thavolia, and thank you everyone who attended, all those of you who are attending for the first time or who have been attending. It's a true honor to have you here. And thank you, Vanessa Holden. Thank you, Jessica Johnson, for hosting this. Thank you to Alex Hill. And it's not done yet. We have another book this delight is then creating this because of the glossy cover, then by Sophie White. This is her book, Voices of the Enslaved, Love, Labor, and Longing in French Louisiana. And this is going to be on May the 5th, also at 5 p.m. Then just go to the page that is www.slaveryarchive.wordpress.com. Yes. And then you are going to find there the entire calendar until June. And in June, we restart with a new calendar for the second year. We have authors who will be with us in the next year. Vanessa Holden with her new book, also Tamika Nunley with her great book that is already out. Then please register, spread the word, subscribe to the channel, tell your students, and buy the books and read the books. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and stay safe. We are not out of the woods yet, but you are going to be fine soon. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.